Good evening. Thank you so much for being here. Tonight, I'm going to switch gears and talk about parenting, a specific topic in parenting, Christian parenting to be specific. Plan to do the same thing tomorrow. So tonight and tomorrow are about parenting. If you don't know, I'm a father of 5. I have 4 girls. Only 3 of them are here today. One of them is grown up and she's out of the house. And I also have a boy, not really a boy anymore. He's actually driving back from college this evening. He's staying the night at a friend's house in Atlanta. So, I've been married for about 29 years now. I've had 5 kids, and I love it. Highly recommend it. But I do. Parenting is a passion of mine. The subject of Christian parenting is something that I've developed into a passion. I'm very passionate about the subject, and I'm thankful that you've allowed me the space and time to just devote a couple of sermons to it. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in depth tomorrow, but most of you already know that if you're a Christian parent, your primary job is to shape and mold your kids into the image of Jesus. And I hit that pretty hard tomorrow morning. But Jesus told his people, after he had been given all authority in the heavens and the earth, he told his people to go out into all of the world and do what? Make disciples of all the nations. So that means, very practically, on a real life basis, if you're a Christian parent, that means you are to be making disciples in your household. No need to go out into all the world for that particular one. You've got kids. Not everyone does, but if you have kids, you're to make disciples out of them. That's inherent, actually, in the mission statement that Paul gives to Christian dads. He says in Ephesians 6:4, he says, fathers, don't provoke your children to anger, but what? Instead, bring them up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord, i.e., go make disciples, dads, of your kids. So in real life, this means things like helping your children learn to respect authority, because they respect the authority of King Jesus. It means modeling what a servant leader looks like. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that tomorrow as well. It means showing them, whether you're a mom or a dad, what real Christ-like love looks like on a daily basis. It means helping your kids make sense of this crazy world. In other words, it means helping them get through it, navigate it, but just filter through it with a Christian worldview. We really have a big job to do as Christian parents. It's hard work. It's not an easy thing to do. But it's especially hard because we have an enemy who is a bully. I talked about this, I referred to this on Wednesday evening. The world in general is a bully, but specifically the devil is an enemy. He does not appreciate God, certainly doesn't appreciate God's people or the work that God's people are doing. So we have an enemy as Christian parents who is constantly trying to undermine our efforts as disciples. That's where, if you look up at the title, that's where in that little tiny print, you get the word deconstructionism. I want to focus basically on that tonight. Deconstructionism, especially in matters of faith, is really all about questioning traditional Christian beliefs and rejecting Christian authorities, and doing that in an attempt to replace them with something else. And so the idea is to tear down beliefs, long-held and long-standing beliefs, and replace those beliefs with something else. So faith in God is being deconstructed and replaced with something else. Now, You guys already know that, basically. If you've been watching the news cycle at all for like the last 5 years, that's an easy sell for you tonight. You guys have seen that. You've already seen that Christianity is under attack. You've probably seen that the Christian family and how that's defined is being targeted. You've seen that Christian principles are being basically torpedoed. I'm going to ask, though, what else is under attack? I'm going to suggest to you that the very words, the words that make up our faith, biblical words, Christian words, God's words, those are being targeted. Satan is intentionally taking words and changing their meaning to advance his agenda. He has an agenda and it's different than God's. And so he's taking words that we use and changing their meanings. And unfortunately, our kids and our grandkids are in his crosshairs. Before I get any further, I preached this sermon before. I remember preaching this sermon in Kentucky once. I got to the end of it, and this sweet lady, she came up to me and said, I feel terrible in saying this, but I don't have much that I couldn't get much out of your sermon tonight. I'm like, why is that, dear sister? She's like, I don't have kids. I'm like, okay, all right, learning moment for me. You may not have kids. You may not ever plan to have kids. But if you belong to this congregation, you know people who have kids, and you know parents, you know the grandparents, you know the families. And our job as God's people is to support God's people, right? And so if you're a grandparent, if you're an aunt, you're an uncle, you're a mom or dad, we have to think about this very, very carefully because our kids are in Satan's crosshairs. So tonight, in the context of Christian parenting in the age of deconstructionism, we're going to talk about something that I call stolen words. The effect that they have on their children and what we can do as parents and grandparents and just the church in general. Sound good? All right. So the way culture uses its words has always been a very fluid thing. It's always been changing. It's called semantic change. Semantic change is actually a normal part of how language works. For example, none of us were around, but in the 16th century, referring to someone as a bully, that was actually kind of a positive thing. It was the equivalent of calling them like a darling or a sweetheart. It's just how they talked about back then, 16th century. By the time the 17th century rolled around, the meaning of that word had kind of slid downhill. It shifted drastically from like fine fellow to more like blusterer, to finally stopping at the meaning that it's closest to us now, like a harasser of the weak. All right? Today, other words, cool, like the word cool. You remember seeing that, Gen X? Cool? I love that word. I still love that word. I probably use it too much. But it doesn't mean what it used to mean. Neither does the word gay. The word gay used to mean happy. It doesn't mean that anymore. Or even the word like nice. Some words have actually disappeared completely from our language, confirming the notion that language itself is fluid, it's ever-changing. Honestly, semantic change is normal. You're going to get that with whatever kind of people you're with, no matter what time you're living in. Semantic change, normal. But word theft is not normal. Let's talk about that. Word theft is the practice of changing a definition to force others to agree with an agenda they might not normally agree with. That's what it is. Basically, it's about purposely redefining words to get your way. And so people who do this will take the standard definition of a word and then they'll replace it with one of their own to advance whatever agenda they're trying to achieve. That's why it's called word theft. They're thieving words, basically. Now, at this point, you might be asking, preacher, like, what's the big deal? Aren't words just kind of like a social thing? Why does it matter if words change? Why does it matter if someone changes their meaning? Well, words and their meaning are incredibly powerful. powerful and therefore important. Not all words, but many words. For example, the ancient Greek word for word is logos, which is used to describe Jesus himself. John said in his first chapter, verse 1, in the beginning was the logos. In other words, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was what? The Word was God. Talking about Jesus, John was saying this Word is God. That's powerful stuff. We can't mess with that either. John 1:14 says the Word became flesh. In other words, the Logos became flesh, dwelt among us. We saw His glory as the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and full of truth. So, wow, some words are, like cool and nice. They have relatively little meaning. Other words are incredibly important because they represent ideas, they represent doctrine, they represent, in the case of John 1, God Himself. So why talk about things like semantic change and word theft in a meeting like this? Our children, our grandchildren, our families are especially vulnerable to this kind of thing right now, because in our world today, it's been going on, I've been tracking it for a while. In our world today, some are attempting to use language to undermine Christ and His values. That inherently is the problem. They don't want your children to submit to King Jesus. They don't appreciate King Jesus. They don't appreciate His rule, and instead they're trying to endeavor whatever kingdom of their own making. So what they've done or are attempting to do is change the definitions of words. You can see this in how the meaning of the rainbow has changed. Right? I'm looking at some of the older people, and when I say that, I mean that most positively. I love you boomers, okay? I really do. That's not like an old boomer, but no, I love you boomers. You're not going to ever invite me back. But grandparents, I'm going to talk to you for a moment. Grandparents, when you were young, the rainbow probably stood as a symbol for God's covenantal faithfulness. In all of your culture, all your friends and family, didn't matter what they believed, they understood that that's what that meant. That's your generation. Now your grandchildren are being taught, not just exposed, but they're being taught that the rainbow is a symbol of pride. Man's pride and man's sexual preference. That change has taken a couple of decades to come about. It's been a slow burn. It's been a slow change. But here we are. The rainbow doesn't mean what it used to mean in society. How'd that happen? It happened by word theft. It happened by word theft. That word got taken and replaced. The rainbow and what it stands for was stolen by those who don't wish to submit to Jesus or His authority. There's other words like marriage, and love, and hate, and equality, and justice, and male, and female, and tolerance, and oppression. Those are all biblical words, biblical concepts. But those are also words that are being targeted in our culture. So that's really why I'm talking about this subject in this meeting. It's very relevant. It's also very relevant towards our kids. It's something that we have to be at least aware of and navigate as parents, as we go about this task of raising our children to come to know God, but to do it in today's culture. All right, so as a tactic, word theft, I want to say, has been proven to be very effective. Here are three reasons why. First, it just stops discussion in its tracks. What do we mean by that? Most people, including our kids, have a built-in sense of right and wrong. They have a conscience. God made us like that, so we innately know what God's standard for right and wrong is. And even those who have never even cracked open a Bible, they still know the difference. Paul talks about that in his letter to the Romans, specifically in Romans chapter 2, about those who don't have the law. That would have been the law of Moses, but those who didn't even have the law, they still do what is right and show that God has placed a sense of right and wrong in their hearts. He said it like this in Romans 2:15, since that they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts. They have this in their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness. So we naturally get that love and patience are right. That makes sense, right? And yet when we hear words like abuse or hate or intolerance, we instinctively view them as wrong. There's a reason for that. If just thinking about the word abuse probably makes you bristle for various reasons, but it just probably makes you bristle because no one wants to be associated with that word abuse, especially abuse of any kind. So certain words appeal to our innate sense of right and wrong. Word theft is really effective because it controls the conversation here. By changing the definition of words, you can convince someone that they're on the wrong side of the issue. If they feel it, they're going to be convinced, and you can do it, that they're on the wrong side of the issue and thus shut them down. It also compels action without thinking through the issues. I want you to imagine how you'd feel if it's just you and like a hungry wolf, a wild wolf in the forests here in Wisconsin. You didn't have a gun or weapon of any kind. You're just walking through, and here comes a pack of wolves. How would you feel at that point, right? I can imagine that your heart would probably start racing, and you'd probably start breathing heavily. You might freeze in place. You unable to move out of fear. You might be like me and just hightail it out of there and start tripping over yourself and look like a fool. You might feel that urge to run away. You might feel the urge to fight. Here's the deal. The part of your brain that's responsible for the feeling of fear, it's called the amygdala. The amygdala is great for you when you meet a wolf in the woods, but not so great when you need to think through an issue that requires an informed decision. Thinking rationally is a function of a different part of your brain called the prefrontal cortex. In the Bible, there's an account of a businessman who started a riot, and he did it by playing on people's sense of fear. Check out Acts chapter 19, verses 23 through 28. Here, Luke records, about that time there occurred no small disturbance concerning the way, for a man named Demetrius, a silversmith who made silver shrines of Artemis, was bringing no little business to the craftsmen. In other words, he was making a lot of money for them. These he gathered together with the workmen of similar trades and said, men, you know that our prosperity depends on this business. You see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a considerable number of people, saying that gods made with hands are no gods at all. Not only, check this out, not only is there danger that this trade of ours will fall into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis be regarded as worthless, and that she whom all of Asia and the world worship will be dethroned from her magnificence. When they heard this, what were they filled with? Rage. And they began crying out, saying, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Demetrius was really working the amygdala of his audience that day. I doubt that he understood it was the amygdala, but he's working on that sense of fear. Guys, our prosperity hangs and depends on this. There's danger here. If we don't get something to happen, our livelihoods will be taken away from us. He was playing on their sense of fear. Our religion will be regarded as worthless, he was saying. Those are all statements designed to stir up the crowd by playing on their sense of fear. And it worked. It absolutely worked. It was very effective. Because when the crowd heard what Demetrius had to say, they were filled with that sense of rage. So word theft works well because it tends to trigger us with our sense of fear. There's no time for thought. There's no time for reason because everything is a crisis. That's why actually you hear Again, it's not just one news station. So it's Fox News, it's CNN, it's whatever. But that's why you hear there's no time for thought, because you need to take action. You need to demand change. It's time to fight. These are desperate times. They're playing on our sense of fear. So word theft works because it often stops good discussion in its tracks, and it compels action without thinking through the issues. Third, it also turns negatives into positives. The Old Testament had something to say about this. Isaiah, we know this one. He said, "Woe to those who call evil good," as in they are dangerous and they are condemned, these false prophets. Woe to them who call evil good and good evil. Doesn't that sound like our times? Who substitute darkness for light and light for darkness. Who substitute bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. As an example of this, in our country a few years back, our then nation's Speaker of the House of Representatives once called opposing abortion, she called it sinful. In remarks at the roundtable on women's reproductive health at the University of California. One has to wonder what her definition of sin is, because it clearly contradicts what God has to say about that matter. But that's what that tactic does. It takes issues that have been defined for literally millennia, tens of thousands of years, and defined as evil, and attempts to turn them into which is good and right. It does exactly what Isaiah warned about. And so what was once evil is now being redefined as good, and what is good is being redefined as evil. So word theft is an especially effective tactic for cultural change, because it tends to stop discussion in its tracks. It tends to compel action without thinking through the issues, and it tends to turn negatives into positives and vice versa. I want to talk about three, I think, high-profile examples of what's being stolen in today's culture. Probably the most high-profile is the word love. Everyone loves love. Everyone, as long as they get to define what it is, right? Historically, and I mean for like millennia historically, love has been defined as to will the good of another, like brotherly love, that kind of thing, or just like wanting and doing what's best for one another. But now, anything that makes someone else uncomfortable is deemed unloving, and furthermore, we're being told that love blindly accepts what others believe, even if that belief contradicts reality. Reality. If the Bible tells us that God is love, so it follows that He gets to have the final say on what that actually is. His definition is really the only one that matters. In 1 Corinthians 13, the Bible tells us that, among other things, love does not rejoice in unrighteousness. Defining love. Love does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth. So far from being blind to morality, love considers that which is true and right. Leads me to the second word that I want to highlight, and that's the word truth. Oh boy, today's culture has placed a possessive pronoun in front of truth. There's no longer the truth, but it's his truth, her truth, your truth, her truth, Uncle Bob's truth, Aunt Gertrude's truth, my dog's truth, right? This is especially dangerous because it's messing with the foundations of reality. It's funny, but it's not, right? Men, women, children are being taught, they're being educated to ignore their own biological gender and identify as anyone and anything that they want. And so the only thing that's absolutely true is the belief that there's no such thing as absolute truth according to this ideology. It makes your head spin, of course, if you track that. So in today's culture, it's become unloving and uncaring and intolerant to say anything against another's truth, even if now science is being ignored. Because it contradicts the paradigm of tolerance, which is the third word I wanted to bring up. This word's making a big impact right now. Historically, tolerance has been defined as the ability to live peacefully with people of different beliefs. But now all beliefs, no matter how outlandish, they are being demanded as being treated as equally legitimate. So tolerance, it started out, it still is, by the way, a very Bible thing. But in culture, it started out as a good thing, and then it just got hijacked. Romans 14 details tolerance within our Christian culture regarding personal convictions and opinions. I like actually Oxford Dictionary. It just still states, I couldn't believe it, but it actually still states the ability or the willingness to tolerate the existence of opinions and behavior that one dislikes or disagrees with. That's tolerance. That's actually a pretty good definition of biblical tolerance. But that just implies that there's a disagreement that you have with someone or something that you don't like. And yet when people talk about tolerance today, just ask yourself, are they asking for people to accept their belief as equally true or to live with them in peaceful disagreement? That's really the crux of this. The Bible defines it one way, culture is defining it the other way. And so tolerance today has been just reduced to neutrality and strong convictions not tolerated unless they agree with yours. So there's just a large list, I think, of buzzwords that are being manipulated right now in order to bring about societal change for whatever agenda. All right, here's the deal. What can we do about this as parents? Because there's a reason I brought this to you today and to talk about this as parents. First, mom and dad, you have to personally know the difference between how the world defines and uses these words and how God does. I think this is probably one of the most practical things that I can probably leave you with. You have to know the difference between how the world is using it and how God is using it. For example, there's a difference between how 80 to 90%, maybe more, of our 21st century society is defining justice and how God defines justice. Social justice, according to the world, and biblical justice are two very different things. I'll give you an example of that. God's definition is about personal accountability. It's about collective responsibility. Well, it's not just about us, it's about collective responsibility. It's about fairness. It's about merciful generosity. It's about goodness. It's about both giving and receiving that which is just. And I've provided some scriptures up there to account for that. And if you want them later, I'll be glad to give you that. The world's definition is very different than that. I want to hit the pause button. All right, I've heard a lot of my Christian friends and buddies, and I'm right there with them. If you're like, hey, wait a minute, like I know how God defines justice in His Bible, and I'm calling that social justice. If you're equating God's definition with social justice and you're lining those two up, I'm like, okay, cool. I'm cool with that, right? But what I'm talking about is most of the people in culture, when they think of the word justice or social justice, they are thinking of something very different, and they're using those words very differently than how God uses them. For example, I just basically pulled this up on Google, okay? But here's the world's definition of justice. Political actions taken to liberate those perceived to be in an oppressed identity group, suffering under the oppressors. These political actions include the dismantling, deconstructing, reordering society, its structures. Social justice concentrates on identity markers such as class, race, gender, sexual orientation. It seeks to redistribute wealth, goods, power from one people group to another. And the progenitor of this idea is Karl Marx, one of history's most famous and prolific atheists. That is why I'm saying the world's definition of social justice is very different than God's definition. The way people use that. All right, so yeah, there's a marked difference between God's definition of justice and the world. Someone once said it's no good having the same vocabulary if we're using different dictionaries. That's true. So as parents, you know what? We just need to know that. We need to personally be educated with how these words are being defined and how they're being used. We need to know the difference. Secondly, we need to be, of course, seeking answers from the one who created life. I mean, what does God have to say about love? What does God have to say about truth? What does God have to say about equality and justice and fairness and gender? What does he have to say about all those things? How does he define those words? How does he define good and evil? What does he have to say about human sexuality and gender? Because he has a lot to say about that. He created us. He knows us. He designed us. He actually formed us, each one, in our mother's womb. So what he has to say matters most. There's several different ways to correctly define biblical words and topics. I mean, use an old-fashioned Bible dictionary, using concordance, go online. Most importantly, just go to your Bible and use context, right? Do what you have to do to build a correct framework, but seek life's answers to life's questions from the one who created life instead of going to Google or AI or social media or culture to find answers. Go to God. See what he has to say. He is the authority here. So seek answers from him, parents. Third, here's the deal. Don't be embarrassed to state your position as a parent. I'm almost 50, and I can't believe how embarrassed I can get at some time. I'm a grown man. But I still struggle with this. Our enemy has managed to associate himself with some historically positive words like love and tolerance and inclusivity, which by default leaves us associated with their negative counterparts like hate and bigotry and exclusion. I mean, who wants that, right? It's super easy to be embarrassed about this kind of stuff. Brothers and sisters, why are we allowing that? It's not unloving to point out false definitions. It's not unloving to point out fake news. It's not hate when we disagree. Disparity and exclusive beliefs are not always synonymous with injustice. Intolerance. So if that were true, I think everyone would be intolerant. So don't be parents who are ashamed of the gospel. Don't be parents who are ashamed of the word of God and what you're reading in the Bible. For it really is the power of God to save everyone who believes, including your kids. To the Jew first and also to the Greek. So ultimately, Christians really are on the winning side of this. God will not be bested. He will not lose. So he will be on the winning side of this spiritual battle. And so we have no reason to be ashamed because God will not be defeated. So don't be embarrassed. Speak God's truth and love to your kids and decide to engage with them. In Matthew 5, 13 through 14, Jesus said, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has become tasteless, how can it become salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under the feet of men. You are the light of the world. A city set on the hill cannot be hidden. Salt and light." We understand that. Because the world is corrupt and it needs preserving. Light because there's darkness in the world and we are the light. Not everyone's going to welcome our beliefs, but parents, that doesn't excuse our responsibility to engage and be salt and light to this dying world. So what does that look like as a parent? Kids, you're going to hate this. Parents, listen closely to your kids' conversations this week. Pay attention to what they're viewing on TV. Check out their social media. Check out their phones. You actually get to do that because you're the parents. I'm pretty sure they're not paying for that phone bill. Told you kids you'd hate this. But parents, engage. What words have your kids absorbed from the culture that needs to be corrected? May not be anything, but there might be. So if you hear them use like a hijacked word, set aside to just talk about it. Just talk about it with your kids. Ask them, hey, where'd you hear that? And what do you think it means? And make sure your kids know the real biblical definition of how God defines these things. Take time, especially fathers, to bring your kids up in the instruction and the admonition of the Lord. Decide to engage with them. And if you don't, someone else will. So here's the deal. For over 3 decades, I've watched the practice of word theft play out. And unfortunately, I think it's becoming more and more prevalent. My own family has experienced it. Like my own kids have experienced it. My firstborn is 23. Her name is Sophia. She is getting her master's right now in psychology. She's going to be a family and marriage counselor. She actually is married, and about a year and a half ago, she had a baby girl. That means I'm grandpa. And I highly recommend being grandpa if you can. I love it. I love everything about it. Yeah. But for like the last 5 years, I've witnessed how Satan has tried to deconstruct my oldest's faith. This is not conceptual for me. This is a reality for me, this sermon. I watched it. And Satan tried to do it through the process of word theft. It happened while she was in college. She went to a small private university. It was about 10 minutes away, so she decided to save money and stay with us. I love that. So she roomed with us, but she went to a local, supposedly Christian university. But she'd come home at night, and because of a relationship that we had developed with her over the years, she'd tell us about her day. She'd talk with us. We didn't have to cajole that out of her. She just did. She just talked to us about her day. She talked about what her professors taught her. And unfortunately, her mom and I heard stories of how some of her professors would challenge her long-standing Christian beliefs about various topics. And they would ask questions. Her mom and I figured it out real quick. They would ask questions designed to break down her faith, i.e. deconstruct it, instead of reinforcing it. And they would use buzzwords like inclusivity and tolerance in an attempt to reshape her thinking. They were trying to take away what she had learned and replace it with something else. That was super disappointing. Here's why. Solomon, who was the wisest man who has ever lived, except for Jesus, of course, here's what he said in Proverbs 1:8. Hear, my son. He's talking to his own boy. Hear, son, your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. Talking to a grown young man. And instead of saying, hey, you have to go figure out things for yourself, you have to go form your own faith, he didn't say that at all. He said, listen to your father's instruction and do not forsake your mother's teaching. Indeed, they are a graceful wreath to your head and ornaments about your neck. In other words, young people, do not let people deconstruct your faith. Do not let them take it away from you. Hold on to it. It is precious. If your father and your mother taught you in the instruction of the Lord, do not forsake it for anything. Do not give it up. Because faith in King Jesus is a blessing and a grace and a treasure more valuable than anything else. So do not ignore the teachings of your faithful parents. Thankfully, my daughter had a good foundation. My wife and I were never perfect parents, but we gave her a good foundation in Christ well before she went to college. So as parents, we taught her the meanings of words and their spiritual relevance. So by the time she got to college, she knew the difference, and she was able to navigate through those challenges. Unfortunately, though, her college story is not unique. Today, Christianity really is being vilified. Right is really being redefined as wrong. Wrong is right, that kind of thing. Satan is actively attempting to deceive us and our children by doing things like shutting down conversations, compelling action without thinking through issues, turning negatives into positives, things like that. And so he's just really targeted important words like love and truth and justice and tolerance and things like that. And he's attempting to transform their meanings into something that aligns with his agenda. Our society is in his crosshairs. So are our families. Our children are vulnerable. And so as Christian parents and grandparents, we need to teach our families what God has to say about these important things. Again, if we don't, someone else will, and words and precious hearts will continue to be stolen. I don't think that anyone wants that. So know the difference between how the world defines these things and uses these words and how God does. Keep seeking answers from God's word. Don't be an embarrassed parent. State your position and decide to engage with your kids. Shaping them, molding them into the image of Christ is hard work, but it is our work and it is worth the effort. Amen? All right, that's my message for this evening. If you want to become a Christian, we encourage you to do so today. Perhaps you're already a child of Christ and would just like to ask for the prayers of the congregation. Whatever your spiritual need is, please come forward and make your wishes known as we stand and as we sing.